the newsagents.
These are protesters in Germany shouting everyone against fascism. But it turns out that perhaps not everyone in Germany is against fascism. After electoral successes for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, an unapologetically nationalist party which has won 32% of the vote in two key regions in Germany.
Liberal Germany is in a state of despair after these election results, which will come only a year away from national German elections. It is the first time since Nazi Germany that a far-right party has won a German election. What does it mean for Germany? Perhaps more importantly, what does it mean for Europe? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And I have already had to reset my password because forgotten, had to re-find my pass because lost, redirected myself to the loo because forgot where everything is.
Yeah.
So,
and you've been giving me holiday
backwards.
advice this morning, which includes going to Transnistria, the disputed region,
yes.
particularly disputed between Russia, of course, which doesn't. I'm not sure my wife will be thrilled about it, but that's okay. Not that you've been on holidays to Transnistria, we should say.
I have been to Transnistria, but not this time.
Next time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good, particularly in winter when
Yes.
icy and bleak.
It's weird that Wish You Were Here never did Transnistria, isn't it? Peculiar that. Odd.
An oversight.
An
I think we
oversight
can
on
agree.
Judith Chalmers' part.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, you've been speaking to Nadim Zahawi.
Sorry, you setting me up because I
was
forgot
setting
what
you
to
up.
do.
Oh, setting you up.
We
via...
have got one of the early, almost first broadcast interviews with
That's what
Nadim
we always want,
Zahawi.
isn't it? Always, almost first. That's what
we
we
love
prize
coming
them
not
in.
quite
Almost
first.
first.
We've talked to Nadim Zahawi, who's just published his autobiography,
Former Chancellor, of course.
the former Chancellor, and we go into details about his own experiences as a child refugee and his party's stance on immigration and why he left and what he's about to do next. All that is to come.
Yeah, but first, we are going to talk about elections which took place on Sunday in Germany. They are regional elections in two former East Communist states. Stick with me here. But they are in Thuringia and in Saxony. And they are really important because, not just for German politics, because they could potentially be a harbinger for what is to come in a year's time, but they fit into a wider pattern of something that we've reported on and talked about a lot on this show, which is the rise of extremist parties across Europe, particularly parties of the far right. So this is a party you might have heard of, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. It was set up about 10, 12 years ago in response initially to the then Eurozone bailout, which convulsed German politics. But over time, it has become, in many ways, a very extremist, far-right party, led by an ethno-nationalist many people call a fascist. Anyway, the AfD is on track to take first place in Thuringia, which used to be part of Communist East Germany, with about 33% of the votes. Huge increase on 2019 when this was last up. And they also got 31%, just shy, in neighbouring Saxony as well. So it means that although they probably will not form the government in those places, in those regions, because the other parties won't work with them, it is the first time, as we were saying at the top of the show, that a far-right party has won a regional election in Germany since the 1930s, since the Nazis were in power.
Yeah, and I guess to put this in context, it is only, these two regions form, I think, only 7% of the German population. So it is not, a Nazi takeover comeback. This is not the story. But I think the story it's telling is about how mainstream parties all over Europe are trying to cope with and neutralise and deal with the threat from extremist parties, because this election was a disaster for the three parties in Olaf Scholz's coalition. His own party, the Social Democrats, came, I think, fourth in one region and fifth in another. The Greens, who he's in coalition with, and the Liberal FDP all saw their share of the vote slump as well. And I think the Greens and the FDP actually are no longer going to be represented in the Thuringian Parliament because, they've basically fallen off the bottom there. And so Scholz has basically called on all the parties that aren't the AfD in Germany not to work with this party of extremism. And curiously, makes for strange bedfellows, but the other party that you will have heard of and know well, who said we're nothing to do with this party, is Marine Le Pen's party in France, the Front National, who's also said they want nothing to do with them because she is now trying to row back from her father's position on anti-Semitism, and the AFD found itself in hot water a few weeks ago when one of its members, who's now been thrown out, was actually talking about people wearing SS uniforms not being criminals. So there has been this, fear and shock and an attempt to sort of neutralise the AFD in Germany and, with some other parties as well. But I guess one of the questions we should ask is, in policy terms, what they actually imagine doing in power. Because they've made very clear that it's all about immigration, it's all about ending free movement and sort of illegal immigration. And it does call into question what that would mean for a country that is part of the EU that allows for a lot of free movement. I mean, is free movement under discussion or not at all? Is this just about asylum seeking? Is it just about illegal immigration?
Well, it has centred upon the rise of the AFD, which we should say has sort of waxed and waned. In other parts of Germany, they've been polling a little bit worse than they have been in perhaps the last year or so. And as we say, these two regions are not necessarily politically representative. That representative, not least because they are part of the former East Germany. And although German unification has been a great success in all sorts of ways, actually politically it's really interesting the extent to which there does remain lots of sort of politically distinct cultures between East and West. And not least, of course, and we can talk about this and the importance of this, voters in the East, generally speaking, according to polls, are much more pro-Russia, are much more pro a deal with Russia, not least because of the economic links that there was between the former East Germany and Russia, Putin and so on, and both the AFD and this new party, which has also come third in these places, the BSW, which is a kind of left populist party, all arguing for a ceasefire, a deal with Russia, an end to the Ukraine war.
Yeah, and an end to military aid. I mean, I think fundamentally it's also about the economics of just sending money to Ukraine that seems bottomless if you are suffering.
Which has been a big transformation in German politics to have taken place in the last couple of years. And as we were talking about on the show last week, a huge increase in Germany towards military spending and arms spending as well, something else these parties are railing against. But it is true to say that underscoring it most of all is this question around migration and refugees and asylum, which we're seeing convulsing European politics generally. I mean, according to a recent poll for German television, 81% of voters across the country, not just in these places, said we need a fundamentally different asylum and refugee policy so that fewer people come to us. And of course, a lot of this does ultimately, people will remember, go back to the great migration crisis of the middle of the last decade, when, of course, as we know, huge numbers of people came from the Middle East in particular and went to Germany in particular, because that was the then policy of the Merkel government. She famously said, "Wir schaffen das, we can do this." Yeah. And that has affected German politics going up to this day, and is underscoring this. We should just say, I mean, sometimes when we've covered it on the show many times, when we're talking about the rise of the far right, and sometimes in Europe, and we've talked about what far right means and the difference between that and the hard right. We did a whole News Agents Investigates episode on it. If people want to go back and listen to it, they can. I think it isn't an exaggeration to say that particularly in these regions of Germany, we are talking about a really extremist force here with the AfD. I mean, let's just remember that the guy who leads the party in Thuringia, a guy called Bjorn Höcke, has twice been found guilty by a German court of purposefully employing Nazi rhetoric. He's considered one of the country's most extreme politicians, and indeed the local parties in Saxony and Thuringia of the AfD have been designated by German state security as extremist organisations. Yeah. And yet, despite all of that, and indeed maybe disturbingly because of it, a very large percentage, albeit a minority, of voters, electors in these places have decided to support the party. I mean, that is going to shake Berlin, but it is also going to shake Brussels as well, because as we've been saying, this is part of a wider European trend away from the centre, or at least a very shaky centre, particularly in the two engines of Europe, France and Germany. And if the kind of liberal order, the pro-European order as we've known it, is shaky, the foundations are shaky in those places, and they're not coming apart yet, but as we've seen in France it's happening, and in Germany too, that is going to make a lot of European leaders, particularly within the EU, nervous, because it could potentially change the disposition of the EU itself in a way that political changes in other countries just cannot and will not do.
Yeah, and I think the pressure on Schulz shouldn't be underestimated. And whilst you may or may not care who the Chancellor of Germany is, I think it speaks to a nervousness that his own position as the sort of, the left of centre candidate is no longer enough to keep parties like this at bay. And there are still some voices, some analysts who wonder whether, they might get rid of him. They might say, what we need to do, what, America did, the Democrats did with Biden, swap him out, make sure we've got somebody in place who actually looks like he can take them on. So as ever, it's not just about the parties themselves and what they're capable of. We are talking, as we've said, about critical but very small minority voices in these elections. It's about the ramifications it will have on centrist politicians too, I think.
Completely, and because as we can see from the polls, and indeed has been replicated in these elections, the party which is most likely to regain power in Germany in a year's time, because we should say there is a year, the next federal elections in Germany will take place next September, this time next year, will be the CDU, which is Angela Merkel's old party. It won't be Angela Merkel, it'll be somebody else, but it will be the CDU, the kind of traditional centre-right party in Germany. They're polling well, they did pretty well in these elections as well. They will do so nationally, and it is very unlikely that they would work with the AfD in any kind of formal way, just like the other parties won't either. But it is true to say that as we have seen in our own country, and as we see time and time again in Europe, the rise of a radical, if not far-right force like the AfD does have ramifications and impact on the way centre-right parties think, the way they talk, the way they act, the way they legislate. So there is no doubt that although the CDU, the kind of the cordon sanitaire, as it's called, the kind of like iron wall between sort of hard right or far right and centre right, might sustain in Germany in a way that it hasn't in other countries in Europe, France or Sweden, for example, Netherlands. There's no doubt that it will affect how the CDU govern if they come to office, and
what their policies will be on immigration,
and what their policies will be on immigration, and how Europe operates, and all of these sorts of things. And there is no doubt that these results are yet another, as you've alluded to, Emily, a nail in the Scholz coffin, in the sense that his government, and Keir Starmer might want to sort of think about this sort of centre-left government that came to office with a reasonable mandate, but quickly found itself mired and stuck in the mud around the economy, economic questions, lack of policy direction, being buffeted around by cultural forces, particularly on immigration as well. It found itself unpopular very, very quickly and has never really been able to regain political momentum, despite the fact that some of those problems have not been of its own making. And it has found itself increasingly peripheral to the conversation in German politics, which it is clear is drifting to the right. Maybe not to the far right nationally, but undoubtedly to the right.
And questions about, whether you still want to underwrite Ukraine's war against Russia.
Yep.
If you're imagining a Trump victory, which, many people still are, do you want to be part of that coalition that is sort of fighting Trump on giving money to Ukraine when actually there are voices in your own country that say enough is enough? I think all these things are going to have an impact on the whole balance, really, of Europe in the next couple of months ahead.
Well, you can also see, just one other thing, you can also see, as we've seen in France, actually how popular the AfD, this extreme right force, are with younger voters as well. So 37% of 18 to 24-year-olds in Thuringia voted for the AfD. It's a 20-point increase on 2019. Likewise, 31% of young people in Saxony. And again, we've seen the same with the RN, the National Rally in France, and others as well. We think of these forces as being sort of old, a bit, maybe we think of as a la Trump or whatever, older voters, sort of those sorts of people. Not so in continental Europe. It's a big difference. Younger people are increasingly, I think mainly as a result, finding their economic message appealing, increasingly turning to the far right, which is pretty disturbing.
In a moment, we'll be hearing from Nadim Zahawi, the former Chancellor, the man who was found to have breached the ministerial code by failing to be transparent over his tax affairs, who later paid back nearly £5 million to the treasury, and the man who left Iraq as a child refugee and became Chancellor of the Exchequer. Nadim Zahawi, you've called your autobiography Boy from Baghdad. It seemed to me, even the title seemed to nod to the sense that at times you can't quite believe this is you, that you're the kid who lived the first 10 years of his life in Iraq, then became this very successful businessman, then rose to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you're still pinching yourself.
It's true. My cousin, who's a few years older than me, didn't leave Iraq, ended up on the front line in Saddam's first war in the 80s. Do you remember when Saddam went to war with Iran.
Of course.
He ended up being taken prisoner of war. 12 years, his young wife was waiting for him with a couple of babies. He comes back and his kids are grown up. And that could have been me. And so when you sort of think about life, and I reflect today, I became second Lord of the Treasury. And you think, how did this happen?
Yeah. And what comes across, certainly in the early part of the book, is how British the family felt. Even before you came here, you write about the M&S Christmas pudding and your grandmother being wedded to the Diana Charles wedding, watching it on repeat over and over again.
And just think, she doesn't even speak English.
Where did that come from? That sort of instilled with that sense of the...
It was probably because to my family, on both sides, the British involvement in Iraq was seen as very much the sort of the positive rather than a sort of negative history.
And there's an extraordinary chapter, actually, Goodbye to Baghdad, where you tell this very dramatic story of your father having to flee the country when it suddenly becomes clear that he's about to be arrested, possibly thrown in jail or tortured or shot. You don't know. The authorities decided he was a spy. Just take us through. I mean, as I said, it's a very evocative chapter, but take us through what happened that night.
Yeah. So we were at my auntie's home. My father had employed a distant relative. And remember, Iraq, people had to belong to the one-party state.
Yeah.
You had to belong to the Ba'ath Party. So everyone had to belong. If you're a teacher, a bus driver, a firefighter, whatever your background is, you had to belong to the party. Unless you're an entrepreneur, which my father was, and he refused to join the party. And being Kurdish didn't help. That's probably an understatement. But this young man decided to initially blackmail my father, and then, although he was forgiven and stayed on in the business, he decided to write a report. And if you write a report on someone in Iraq, that's all it took. As luck would have it, this young man is related to my aunt's husband, and we got a message saying they're going to come take my father away.
They thought he was a spy.
Spy. You didn't have to do much in Iraq in those days. If you represented an international company,
and he was in construction.
In any walk of life, they can put you in jail. If you were an agent for an international company, they can put you in jail. So at lunch, he was told, "Look, they're coming to get you. You've probably got hours, at best, a day." So I remember having to, leave lunch abruptly, get home, think about what to do next. He booked a Swissair flight instead of the Iraqi Airways because we've heard stories where they can actually turn the plane back. If it's Iraqi Airways, they
like the Belarus flights.
Exactly, they can instruct the pilot to come back.
Yeah. And he left with nothing. He left with an overnight bag.
Overnight bag,
a diamond necklace that was meant to be
anything that he could hopefully sell and get cash.
I mean, he, in the very real sense of the word, he sought asylum. He was an asylum seeker in this country. You've had the immigrant experience firsthand. A year later, you and the family came, and you describe it viscerally. Growing up, learning a language that isn't your mother tongue, understanding that your parents will be seen as foreigners or outsiders in a way that you won't. I wonder how you felt about the language that your own government used towards immigrants in the last years. When Suella Braverman talked about invasion, Rishi kept on drilling home, stop the boats, even on the podium. When Robert Jenrick is talking about cannibalising the compassion of the British public, painting over Mickey Mouse murals to make distraught kids leaving everything they knew feel slightly less isolated. I wonder what the young Nadim was thinking, hearing that kind of language time and again from your own government.
So I think, look, we almost have to unpack this thing a little bit, in the sense that immigrant families, including my own, feel pretty aggrieved that people can jump the queue or the illegal migration.
Okay, don't unpack that too much,
Yeah,
because
but do you see
Nadhim,
what
when your father came, obviously it wasn't legal for him in the sense that he was seeking asylum.
Yes.
He had wealth.
Yes.
Many of these people who come now don't.
Yes.
But there was nothing that allowed him to do what you're saying many of the people who are trying to get in now aren't.
And that's, I was going to come to that second bit, which is to say, part of the problem, the sort of the well of goodwill has been poisoned by this sort of, the 40,000 a year, boats coming over illegally.
It's 0.7%. I think it's
I don't
0.7%
disagree.
of
I was about to say 40,000 compared to 740,000 net migration, right?
Okay,
Which
but
is the legal
we're talking about
migration.
0.7%. I guess I'm not even talking about the numbers. I'm saying when you hear that kind of demonisation.
None of that language sits well with me.
Did you tell that to your colleagues?
I would much rather, and I've been saying this a lot this past few weeks, as we came together on vaccine, or when we gave Her Late Majesty that send-off we delivered, I think we need a much more grown-up debate about migration.
Why didn't you say that at the time? Because you knew that they were being demonised. You knew that the scapegoating of people with devastating stories like yours, who were trying to escape tyrants, trying to escape torture, was going on. Why didn't you turn around and say, this language is not acceptable for our party?
I don't think the people in my party that you've just talked about, whether it's Rob Jenrick or
Invasion.
anybody else, I know, but I don't think they would disagree with me when I say, in fact, I think Rob is the one who's advocating for a parliamentary debate and a vote on the net numbers that we should be looking to accept in our country.
He ordered the painting over of Mickey Mouse murals. Why would you do that just to make kids who are in that position feel even more isolated?
What my view is that actually what we need to do is do what we did on vaccine, come together, set our differences aside, and say, look, this is the. By the way, Emily, the next decade, 2 decades, is going to be defined across democracies in Europe by this issue, and I tell you for why. If you just take anything south of Libya, there are about 500 million people, right, who are either through political instability, environmental impact, economic impact, are going to be mobile, are going to be moving.
And there's a massive difference between saying we need to talk about the numbers, we need to have a policy.
That's my point.
Which I don't think anyone in the sort of this country or the Western Hemisphere disagrees with. Of course you need a policy to secure your borders.
And I think
but the language of demonisation is something that must surely trigger you to say, why are my colleagues talking about somebody that would have been my father, that would have been me?
And which is why I say to you, we need to have a proper debate about this. By the way, if you talk to immigrant families, they would equally be upset at the rule breaking and the queue jumping and people coming in illegally and then finding a way through the system.
Well, you talk about rule breaking, asylum seeking.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Not really, because I think if you have safe passage.
But if you're not a legitimate asylum seeker, why are you getting on an illegal boat? That's the point that they would make.
Okay, but in terms of, I'm just talking about asylum seekers now, and as you know, we do not have safe routes for people other than from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, or Ukraine. So you would not have been allowed here.
Which is why
Syrians or whatever, in the middle of civil war.
Which is why I say to you, we need a grown-up debate and a strategy.
Yeah.
That I really like the idea of a parliamentary vote on this, because actually it does sort of elevate it. And you have to have safe routes going forward. The other thing you've got to do, by the way, and you're beginning to see countries come together and form alliances, is deal with the upstream. Investment in Africa. Look at how
Of course, and somebody like Andrew Mitchell, who's been right at the forefront of saying we need to really help these countries rebuild to a place where people aren't leaving. But
exactly right.
I guess what it really comes down to, Nadim, is a question, and it's something that I've toyed with reading the book, which is your curious relationship about party loyalty. Because when it starts, You explained that you had to follow your gut. You didn't get into David Cameron's cabinet because you wanted to be very much part of the preserving of the House of Lords, because that was a moral issue for you.
Reforming it, but not abolishing it.
Okay.
was what I was going
So you
for.
vote with your conscience then, but then you later warn MPs that if you've got MPs' initials afterwards, you should stick together as a party, otherwise the media will write about Tory splits. Now you're saying you'd like to have a grown-up conversation, but I never remember you raising your voice on this issue when you were in government. I'm just trying to work out when politics becomes a matter of conscience for you and when it becomes a matter of loyalty, because that's not clear from the book.
Look, it's probably the central challenge for any politician,
Yeah.
right? It's a team game,
Yeah.
right? And I guess the analogy with football is the same. Is you once you put the shirt on, you're on the pitch, you're playing for the team. If you're unhappy with one of your colleagues because they're not pulling their weight, or they're in the wrong position, or your gaffer, the manager, right, you still do your best, right? But you have a discussion, hopefully in the dressing room, about where you think the unhappiness is coming from and how you can correct it. So so you've got to strike that balance. On the House of Lords stuff, I wanted to hopefully move my leader to a place to say to Nick Clegg, look, we can't create a Senate with 420 senators. It's the wrong thing to do. I don't think it will work, and see if we can move him to a different place. That didn't happen. I was punished for the rebellion with Jesse Norman and others.
I guess the relationship
so I
you've
think,
had with Boris Johnson really epitomises this, because time and again it sounds like you do whatever you feel like doing and then you justify it afterwards. So when it was right for Boris Johnson to go, you call for him to go. And then Boris Johnson calls you up from the Dominican Republic after the Liz Truss debacle and says he wants to come back. And you go, absolutely right, because you've got the mandate. So it's fine for him to come back.
So let me tell you.
Well, what you said in the book it was right that he should.
Correct. When Boris made me Chancellor, he said, look, we've got 2 weeks. We've got to deliver the sort of the economic vision for the country post-pandemic. And I set to work on this. Within 24 hours, we were losing a minister every half an hour. By the afternoon, after he came out of the liaison committee, I call the chief whip and I say, look, by the evening, we're not going to be able to have a functioning government. I need to see the Prime Minister. He said, come over to number 10. I make my way to number 10 and I say to him, I am working flat out to get this economic strategy in place. I will do anything in my power, right? Back to the team player, right, to make this work. Unfortunately, Prime Minister, the herd is stampeding. They're going to drag your carcass out of here, and I can't bear to see this happen.
So you've got
right?
to go.
You've got to think about your position. He then was still in denial. He said, no, it'll be fine. Just get back to the Treasury. We'll get this done. Can you pull it forward by a week? At which point I thought, he's not listening to me. Obviously, overnight, more colleagues resign. By the morning, I think, what do I do now? The best thing I can do is at least just write to him one more time to get him to reconsider his position. The letters must have crossed between the letter getting to him and him deciding actually, the right thing to do is to step down.
Yeah. And then you supported Liz Truss.
Right. And
why? Because you thought she was good, or because Boris Johnson had endorsed her?
No, I'll tell you on Liz in a second. On his wanting to return when Liz resigned, what I didn't want to happen is if we as members of Parliament were perceived to be blocking Boris from being able to put his name forward, and he's got the numbers, right, to the membership to come back, then it would have been terrible. It would have been almost impossible for Rishi to govern.
And you just published an article endorsing him as he pulled out.
That's because the timing issue with...
I think it's all part of the same thing, though, isn't it? It doesn't suggest there is that much clarity or principle. It suggests that you go wherever the wind blows.
That's not true. I think it's quite the opposite. I think actually what I was trying to do was be a team player and do the right thing for my country.
Would you have wanted him to come back?
I think he did the right thing. The reason, by the way, I supported Liz, because I was attracted to her growth plan. I still think the country needs a strategy for growth.
No one doesn't think this country needs to grow.
But
that's
you're
the biggest
asking
truism that you can get.
But you're asking me about what I thought
Yeah.
at the time.
The book draws to a close, Nadim, with this chapter called Notes on a Scandal.
Yeah.
And this is you trying to clarify the circumstances under which you left government. You were found to have breached the ministerial code by failing to be transparent over tax affairs. You later paid back, I think, nearly £5 million of unpaid taxes. At the time, Dan Needle, who is a tax expert, was asking questions about the unpaid sums of money to the Treasury. You tried to restrict him with intimidatory warnings, a slap order. This is a strategic lawsuit against a public participation. Whose idea was that slap order? Did that come from you?
I didn't try and restrict. I was basically trying to defend myself against allegations that were wrong. He was conflating tax evasion and other investigations that were not true.
Dan Needle says that's factually false. He never once said that you were guilty of tax evasion, which he knows is a criminal offence, and he didn't accuse you of lying to conceal tax evasion.
And setting up offshore structures.
He didn't say that.
Well, that's what it felt to me. That
you can't say it felt that to you. Either he said it or he didn't say it, and he's saying he didn't say that.
I can go back and check.
No, I mean
his tweets.
He's questioned what you've written in the book because he thinks it's potentially libelous. So just clarify: did you order that slap order?
I didn't order anything other than to say to my lawyer, look, if Daniel wants to engage with us constructively, we can go through all his questions.
So the lawyer did that off his own bat?
No. I said to my lawyer, I want you to write to Dan Needle and to say, look, I can't answer your questions on Twitter. We need to have a proper discussion, and I'm very happy to have that discussion with you.
Dan Needle says they ordered me to retract my claim that Zahawi had lied to cover up the tax avoidance, which was true, and said if I even mentioned their threat to anyone, it would be a serious matter. The attempt to silence me caused widespread outrage and has led to his lawyer being prosecuted before the solicitor's disciplinary tribunal. Did that slap order come from you?
Well, first of all, my solicitor's going through that tribunal at the moment. It would be wrong for me to comment on that. I think that's completely wrong. There was no slap order coming from me.
But here was a tax expert who was asking these questions.
Yes.
And you were silencing him,
No, I
or
wasn't.
your lawyer was silencing him.
You are factually inaccurate because he was never silenced.
Well, he got a
silenced.
slap order.
No, he got sent a letter from
Strategic
my lawyers
against public.
No, saying that we are happy to engage with you constructively, but some of what you're saying is wrong.
Why do you think your solicitor's up against the disciplinary tribunal?
Well, let's see what the tribunal says. I think it's only fair to wait until that is concluded.
Has this whole business put you off politics?
Has it put me? No, quite the opposite.
It hasn't put you off business. Let me get this right. Do you actually own the Telegraph at the moment?
No.
Are you actually trying to buy the Telegraph at the moment?
I can't comment about a process, as you, I'm sure, are aware in business until deals are done.
Would you like to own the Telegraph?
But it'd be a privilege to be involved with the Telegraph.
Were the authorities wrong to stop it going to the UAE?
I think Parliament took a decision. I think I worry about how open our investment decisions are in the United Kingdom. I think that we needed to have a policy vis-a-vis media ownership. I think it was right to look at that. If Margaret Thatcher was alive today, she'd say you do it through regulation, not legislation, because regulation is much more agile. I'd be worried about independence. You'd want the Telegraph and the
a hands-off
Spectator
approach
to remain independent, and for the company that's buying it, IMI and Redbird, to demonstrate why the editorial team and leadership would be completely independent of them. That's important. But you do that through regulation, is my view.
So in a perfect world, the next stage of Nadim Zahawi's journey could be ownership of the Telegraph with a role for Boris Johnson?
In a
Indulge
perfect
me.
world.
It's a perfect world.
Perfect world. Lots of things would be wonderful to dream about and to think about. There's a process taking place. As I say, I can't comment on that. I'm doing lots of things. I'm looking at loads of stuff around the world in everything from AI to life science to education. I'm very lucky. I've always had that business career before politics. And so I'm able to sort of return to that. I think I've got a couple. I always look at life in decades. I had a decade at YouGov, over a decade in 14 years in politics. Got to be second Lord of the Treasury, and I think I've got a couple more decades before they put me out to grass. I think. I don't know.
Nadim Zahawi, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go, some quite interesting parliamentary news. A new parliamentary group has been formed. It's been announced today. 5 MPs in Parliament. They're called the Independent Alliance, and with the exception of one, they're all new MPs. So Shoka Adam, Ayub Khan, Adnan Hussain, Iqbal Mohammed, and Jeremy Corbyn, more well-known name. The previous 4 were all elected as part of the clutch of MPs in July who campaigned largely on Gaza, and all won their seats at the expense of Labour MPs, including some very well-established Labour MPs, including Jonathan Ashworth. So now they are going to act as a parliamentary group, which will make them as big as Reform and as the DUP.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what this grouping actually means, because they're not a party, they specifically don't have a leader, but they're hoping that it will open the door to more parliamentary time. In other words, more questions that they can ask in the Commons. And they've said that they want Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, to give them a similar number of speaking slots to those other smaller parties you mentioned. I guess they will concentrate primarily on an anti-war message. We know that has united all of them from the beginning, may have even been what won them their seats, an anti-Gaza war message particularly, and an anti-austerity message, which has been, I guess, at the heart of Corbyn's policies for decades. And I wonder whether there is also a kind of implicit, attraction or threat, if you like, to the Labour Party, which is if you don't like what you're seeing Keir Starmer doing, whether it's on winter fuel, whether it's on the cuts that are going to come in, then know that there is a grouping here for you. I mean, that has not been said out loud, but I think there will be sort of, there will probably be a sense of like, well, there's always this going on. So, if you get unhappy, we're here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in their statement, they have alighted on precisely that theme. They're saying, not just talking about the war, they said, we were elected by our constituents to provide hope in a parliament of despair. Already this government has scrapped the winter fuel allowance for around 10 million pensioners, voted to keep the two-child benefit cap. Millions of people are crying out for a real alternative to austerity, inequality and war, and their voices deserve to be heard. So it is interesting. It isn't guaranteed just because they've grouped together that the Speaker will give them those rights that they're calling for, because they're not a formal political party. If they don't get that, again, there is potentially the incentive to create one. And if it is a harbinger to a kind of left populist political party, and Jeremy Corbyn, although he is a maligned figure in lots of ways, there is no doubt that he in particular could still attract through his name recognition and a not insubstantial following of activists in the country. He could generate real attention. It could be an interesting challenge to the Labour on the left, particularly given how much they struggle with a particular type of voter, particularly Muslim voters in lots of constituencies, and indeed they could have lost more still.
Yeah, do you know what I keep going back to is Change UK. Do you remember which was the party that tried to form itself of all those sort of disillusioned anti-Corbyn Labour MPs and some Lib Dems and all the rest of it.
And some Tories.
Over the Brexit, and some Tories over the Brexit years. And they didn't get anywhere. And people said, I mean, I don't think one was elected to Parliament. They did not have an MP. And everyone said, oh, it just shows how difficult it is to start a new party in the UK. And this is almost like a proper grassroots alternative. Instead of forming a party, they said, right, we're going to do this, as independents, from social media, very locally, get yourself known in the communities in which you operate, and then you form the party afterwards.
And that's become much more common in local government. You've seen that across the country, in England in particular. Sort of people call it, I don't know, the Froome independence or whatever it happens to be, and it sort of largely starts on Facebook and then sort of.
I mean, it's a massive social media phenomenon, because that is how you grow your audience. Yeah. We know that, but it's in the space of 10 years, that's completely changed.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays into the Conservative leadership race, because already it has been a theme on the right, particularly from Farage, and actually even some of the Tory leadership candidates have talked about this as they've been launching their campaign, they've been warning and talking about the rise of a sectarian party, a party which basically represents Muslim voters in particular. Now, obviously this group would deny that and say that that is not the case, but you can imagine a world in which they are pointing, particularly if they do become a formal political party, or even if they don't, they will point to them and say that that prophecy is already happening.
Yeah, and I wonder if for that reason it makes things slightly easier for Keir Starmer, that he's not them. You know, he's now in the centre. You know, we're not doing that. This is where we are.
But Corbyn's still around. And bear in mind, of course, there are those Labour MPs that Starmer kicked out a month or so ago.
Oh, I wouldn't know about that. I wasn't here.
Yeah, well, they are there.
It can't have happened.
It can't
I
have
wasn't
happened.
Here.
No. You've only been listening to news in your Verne. But there are those Labour MPs who are currently whipless on the backbenches, who potentially, particularly if they're led by Corbyn, he could be trying and entice. That's enough for one day, don't you think?
Plenty. It's more than enough.
Plenty.
You're begging us to stop now, aren't you? There are dogs everywhere, shattered and sitting down because they've had too long a walk.
That is just your trip back from France. That's just Moody. That is
Moody.
just a month in the country
shattered,
with you and
sitting
Moody.
down, always asleep.
Yeah.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.